All right, so the topic tonight is Madagascar, and I've entitled it Paradise in Peril because it truly is. It has some of the most incredible animal and plant life on Earth. And so much of it is threatened. It's when you visit there, it's one of the most depressing things to see is just mile after mile after mile of destroyed forests and erosion and poverty. It's very depressing. And the only bits of forest and the only bits of wildlife that are left are what are in the national parks. There is essentially nothing outside of the national parks in the entire island. Okay, so let me just give you a few facts about Madagascar, in case you don't know where it is or anything about it. It's one of the largest islands in the world. It sits off the coast of Africa. Directly across from it is the country of Mozambique. And as I mentioned earlier, it's incredibly biodiverse with over 12,000 plant species, 10,000 of which are endemic. That means they are only found in Madagascar. And the animal species are just as spectacular with 111 lemur species and subspecies, amazing reptiles, chameleons, and so forth. And the people of Madagascar, even though it's so close to Africa, are actually more genetically related to Indonesians than they are of Africans. And they call themselves Malagases. Now, what I'm going to talk about tonight are the key regions of, or the 5 key regions of the ecology, basically, that occur in Madagascar. So on the East Coast, it's very humid and wet, and there used to be an extensive rainforest all along the East Coast. There are little bits of it left, and what's left, as I mentioned earlier, is almost entirely in national parks. The Central Plateau used to be a subhumid forest. Now most of it is wasteland that has been, all the trees have been cut down. And again, the only places you find trees or forests are in national parks and reserves. On the western side of the island, it's much drier. And here you have what's called a tropical dry forest. That means that for part of the year, the leaves fall off the trees, and there's essentially no rain for months at a time. So the plants in this region are adapted to this seasonal variation in rainfall. The very southern tip of the island is what's called the Spiny Forest. You've probably seen pictures of this, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to visit there. And then on the west coast, there is a region well known for its succulents, specifically the giant Baobab trees. Now, Madagascar, when you go there, you almost always can only fly into one place, and that is the capital, which is called Antananarivo, and the locals just call it Tana because the name is so long and hard to pronounce. The population of the whole island is 1.3 million, but 50%, or actually greater than 50% of the population is under the age of 20. So it's a very young population. And for the most part, there's only 2 languages spoken, Malagasy and French. Madagascar used to be a French colony, but it became fully independent in 1960. And since 1960, almost nothing has been done in the way of road building, construction, or much of anything else. So the fact that it was a French colony is probably the only reason it has roads in certain parts of the island. And when you travel on the roads, you'll very quickly learn that most of them are unpaved. There's one 2-lane highway that goes north-south and another one that goes east to west. There's a national airline that's always bankrupt. And it's not uncommon for the planes to be 8 to 12 hours late. So you get to the airport at 6 a.m. to catch your 8 o'clock flight, and you might not leave until 6 o'clock that evening, or sometimes they send you home and you can come back the next day. So traveling by plane here is chancy at best. And like I said, the airline is always going out of business. And with the pandemic, they went out of business again. I guess they're reorganizing. The country is just ravaged from one end to the other by extreme poverty, corruption, natural disasters. And now with the pandemic, there's also a severe famine in the south part of the island, and people there have absolutely nothing to eat. I don't know if you get mail outs from Doctors Without Borders and some of these other organizations that are trying to send food there, but it's really a desperate situation. So what I'm going to talk about tonight are the different ecologies that I mentioned at the beginning. And we're going to visit a number of the reserves and national parks. And so let's just get to it because I got a lot of slides. So what I'm talking about are two separate trips I made to Madagascar. The first one was in 2017 with Stuart McPherson of Red Fern Natural History Expeditions. And his trips are always a little bit more risque or crazy or whatever than most of my other tour trips that I go on. But we went with him on the first trip. The second trip, I then organized an Orchid Conservation Alliance trip to Madagascar. And our guides were Johan and Claire Hernans, who wrote 2 books on the orchids of Madagascar, and they go there almost every year to study the plants there. So we had real orchid experts on the second trip. Now, Fort Dauphine is a town that's on the very tip of Madagascar, and it's a French town with absolutely drop-dead gorgeous beaches. The worst roads I have ever seen in my entire life, and I have seen some pretty bad roads. And it has some very interesting nutrient-poor forests nearby. So when we visited there, we went to this nutrient-poor forest, and interestingly, this is an area where carnivorous plants are plentiful. And here there is a specific species in Nepenthes called Madagascarensis, which means it's from Madagascar, and it's actually found in a couple places on the island, and this is one of them. As you poked around in the ground here, you could see lots of other carnivorous plants, including this Drosera, which is shown up in the corner here. I guess I can't use my arrow. And a Utricularia, which has these little bladders that are underneath, it's sort of in the roots that capture insects. The Nepenthes, the insects are captured in those pitchers that you see dangling down from the ends of the leaves. Now, when we went to Barenty, which is a very well-known reserve, it's the last riverine forest in Madagascar. And as we went down this road, which, as I mentioned, it was unbelievable. There were potholes bigger than my car. If you went into it, you went down into the pothole with your car about 3 or 4 feet, and then you traveled in the pothole for a couple of minutes, and then you'd climb out of the pothole, and then you'd go down into another pothole, and you just went on and on and on like that. And so even though it was only about 30 miles from the town of Fort Dauphine to Barenty, it took 6 hours of driving to get there. As we drove along, we could see these mysterious looking pillars, and what those are grave markers, and the height of the stone is the age of the person, or it's proportional to the age of the person that it's marking. And as you can see, many of those stones are small. They have a very high mortality rate in this part of Madagascar due to malaria that occurs every year and lots of other childhood diseases. In fact, they just finished doing a big polio immunization because they'd had outbreaks of polio, believe it or not, as well as the plague, bubonic plague, right?
Yes, specify the
different plague. So as you're heading to Barenty, you pass this one reserve, which contains this traveler's palm, which is called Dipsis decori, and the leaves all are sort of in one plane, and they're supposedly pointing east-west, which in actuality they were. And there's this big stand of them, again, in this reserve. I think it's the only stand of these native trees anywhere in the world. I think everywhere else has been extirpated. And then as you leave that, you come into another reserve, which is the Spiny Forest. And here you have some really amazing vegetation, pachypodiums, euphorbias, diderias, lots of interesting things. And it looks like it's a pretty big place, but again, it's just this little reserve. And as soon as you exit it, you're back into wasteland again. So in this forest, we saw some of these fantastic Baobab trees and lots of the interesting spiny forest, if you will. And of course, as soon as you stop the car, anywhere you are in Madagascar, people come out of the woodwork. They just show up. Doesn't matter if you're in the middle of nowhere. As soon as you stop the car, they just appear. And so we stopped the car, and then all of a sudden this man jumps out with all of these hand-carved lemurs and so forth. that he was selling. And so we went shopping and we bought a couple. And this is the one I bought, and this is the fellow who carved it. So supporting the local economy. However, as we exited the spiny forest, this is what replaced the spiny forest. Miles and miles and miles of sisal, which is grown for fiber. And it was a very thriving industry. The French were the ones who basically tore it all down and planted the sisal, and they built the road in 1960 that took you to the sisal plant. But now they can't harvest it because the trucks that pick up the sisal can't get there. So that entire forest was ruined, and this is what is left behind. There's just these miles and miles of these ugly plants instead of that beautiful, beautiful spiny forest. Here's some other scenes that you see. The indigenous cattle, which are called cebu, are everywhere. They use them for meat, obviously, but they also use them for transportation, they pull carts, they plow the fields and so forth. And in this part of Madagascar, the typical house is made of sticks, as you see here in the lower part. Much of the rest of the island, the houses are made of brick, but in this region, they're made of these little sticks. So as soon as we pulled into the Barenti Reserve, we were treated to our first lemurs. This is Vero Safaka. If you've ever watched the Discovery Channel, these are the dancing ones that you see dancing across the road. They're just amazing animals. And although we did get to see them do it by the time I got my camera out, they were already off in the trees, but they're pretty spectacular animals. We also saw some other lemurs. I think this one's actually a hybrid, not a species, because normally these lemurs are not sharing the same space, but when they're in these reserves, they're crowded together and sometimes they hybridize. But here's this guy. I'm sure you recognize him from the movie Madagascar. This is the Ringtail Gleamer. And they're amazing little creatures. We saw quite a few of them here in the reserve. And this is a little sportive lemur. These are nocturnal. So when you see them during the daytime, they're always pulled up in a hole in the tree and basically staring at you. And you always wonder how in the world does the guide know where they are? Well, it turns out they're always in the same tree. So he takes you to that tree and sure enough, there's the lemur. We also saw this leaf snake, and this picture at the top here are flying foxes way up in a tree. So there were several hundred of these big bat-like flying foxes. And this plant at the bottom is a Cyanorcus. It's related to milkweed. It's an Asclepiaceae plant. Here's another view of the Safaka. At the bottom is a radiated tortoise. This is a very rare tortoise, highly prized in the pet industry, and has almost been eliminated from Madagascar due to poaching and sending these things off to pet stores all over the world. And here's a close-up of a baobab tree as we walked through this riverine forest. So the riverine forest kind of grades into a patch of spiny forest. And so this is where we're walking around in the spiny forest. We also saw this. This is a nightjar. It's a bird. I don't know if you can make it out there. It's very well disguised against the leaf litter. And it didn't move. I mean, we could have picked it up. It was literally a few feet away from us, but I guess they rely on their disguise to evade predators. And this wonderful owl was also sitting in a tree very close to the trail and wasn't perturbed by us at all. Now, after visiting Barenti, we made our way back down that horrible road and then got back in a plane, flew to Antananarivo, and the next day flew up to the very northern end of the country to Mount Ombre or Mount Amber National Park. This is an area that, again, it's only a park because it used to be an estate of a wealthy Frenchman, and he preserved the forest. And so there's this beautiful forest that you can walk around in with lots of roads. And when you start to walk around, you see the vegetation is completely different. Here we have lots of palm trees. It's a very humid, wet area, sort of on the Eastern Rainforest side of the country. And within minutes of walking in the forest, we saw this cute little Pygmy Kingfisher. And for the birdos in the audience, if there are any, this is a very highly sought after bird that bird watchers go to Madagascar to see. So we were lucky to see it. Here's a ring-tailed mongoose. They're kind of the picnic pest, if you will. When you roll out your sandwiches, this guy appears because he wants some of your food. And then we found these little Brooksia. These are one of the smallest chameleons in the world. He's about the size of my thumbnail. That one right there. And again, you wonder, how does the guide know where they are? They're always in the same place. They don't move very far. Okay, we saw our first orchids. This is a Cyanorcus. It's a terrestrial species. I think it's Ridley eye, and we'll see some of those as we travel to other parts of the country. We also saw some Engracums. I haven't been able to identify the species on this one, but this one particular tree had about 30 plants on it, and there was a half dozen or so that were in bloom. And Oberonia distica, we saw that in several different places on the island. It seems to be very widespread. And I think it's the only Oberonia species in Madagascar. If not, there's only a few, so it's fairly easy to identify. Here's another one of those Engracums. And this one I love seeing. This is Arandus hyaloides, which I have, and I actually won Best Miniature and Show with it at the POS one time. That was the one in the little glass case that, I don't know, Shawnee took a picture of it.
The blue flowers?
No, this one has white flowers.
Oh, okay.
It was a few years ago. And then this one other tree that was covered with some monopodial. I'm not sure what species or even genus that was. And here again, more reptiles. This gorgeous chameleon sitting on a log in a dark forested area. And you can see here he's color matching the darkness and the dark wood. And then here's just showing you how tiny these little Brooksia are. That is my index finger. So they're tiny, tiny little chameleons. Okay, now we're going to head down the west coast. And one of the first places we visited is a place called the Red Singi. This is mostly a man-made, not on purpose, but it's an erosion accelerated by man of this red clay. And it results in this incredible site that is just amazing. So this is all eroded sandstone because the trees and everything were on top have all been cut down. And so when it rains, it just takes big chunks of the clay every year that go down into this valley. And so as you walk around, you can see, some very interesting clay formations and colors. Up on top of that plateau that is above it, what used to be here was probably a Pachypodium forest. So we saw a few residual plants. There were also a couple of palm trees, and that was about it. Most of the rest of it was kind of a brushy scrub. Now heading further down the west coast, we're going to visit the Ankara Reserve. And this reserve is actually pretty interesting. It has a large amount of water that moves through it during the rainy season, and it's created these incredible channels and other formations that are just fascinating. As you walk through it, you'll see some of plants that people have in their collections, probably even here, like some of these euphorbias, big sinkholes. This goes down several hundred feet. There were snail shells everywhere in this area. And my co-author, Ron Parsons, likes to collect land snails shells. So I was picking them up all over the place. There was all kinds of interesting shells in this area. This is a day gecko. They're pretty common in Madagascar. There's a couple different kinds, but they're all about 6 inches long and green, so they're pretty easy to tell. And then the plant that you see on the right is a tree fern, and we're here in the dry season, so it's completely deciduous and lost all of its fronds, and it's just sitting there waiting for the rainy season. And then here you can see how eroded this limestone area is, and more of the weird plants. Here's some of the Pachypodiums that we saw there. And we did see a few orchids, mostly bulbophyllums. None of them were in bloom, and I have no idea what they were, but we did see quite a few of them. And here's an Engracoid and some little seedlings of it on a tree trunk nearby. And then, again, our guide has pointed out this Warted Lemur. And this is another nocturnal lemur. who's always in the same tree, and they just look at you. Really very amazing little creatures, and they're not very big. They're maybe, I don't know, 8 to 10 inches long, just little guys. And then this is another lemur called the crown lemur. He was also a picnic raider because we were having our picnic lunch, and he was hanging around just in case there was some food that he could scrounge. And what people go to this park to see is this. This is called the gray Cindy. As far as the eye can see, of these formations of this highly eroded limestone that is just amazing. And you really can't walk through much of it, but there is a trail that goes over to one part, and then you can cross over this bridge and go over to the other side. It was a pretty spooky bridge, but we did it just to say we did it. And again, on the other side, more orchids, again, the bulbophyllum and then the Greek. And we did see a few chameleons. This is one called the Panther Chameleon. Just a couple different shots of him looking down and then looking up. And then this is a typical town scene when you drive through one of the towns. Notice no motor vehicles. We saw almost no private cars. The only cars and Jeeps that are around are either buses or tourists in, chauffeured four-wheel drives or buses that are being taken to see the sights. The people get around by walking. If they're wealthy, they have a bicycle, and a very rare number of them may have a motorbike. But in this area, there aren't really any gas stations. So the only way you get gas is you buy, it's in a Coke bottle type thing, and you pour it into your gas tank.
Do they have electricity?
No. So there's no electricity. There is some in this little town, but what people use for electricity are solar panels. And these are really expensive for them. So being able to afford a solar panel is a really big deal, but that is their source of electricity. They put the solar panel outside of their wooden stick hut, and that's basically how they power. But most people don't have solar panels. And this is what they use for light. They made these really amazing little inventions of their lanterns with a wick in them, and they put some fuel in the bottom of them, and they reuse some kind of bottle that is common there, and it actually has a little handle, and that's their lamp. So as we passed this area, we took off down a side road to see these guys, and these are the blue-eyed black lemur. And so the females are brown and the males are black. And there's a patch of trees, maybe 20 trees. There were 6 animals in there. That is the entire population of this lemur in the world. There are no more. And it wouldn't surprise me now after the pandemic if there are none left, because they probably ate them. But they were only there because they were a tourist attraction. The tourists would drive off, give the farmers some money to look at the lemurs. They weren't reproducing. They had no babies. It was really a sad sight to see. Well, another national park that's visited by a lot of people on this side of the island is called Ankara Fanatica National Park. And this is a sculpture garden that you see when you come into the park. And within minutes of entering the park, basically all around the parking lot, way up in the trees, you see these Safakas. This is Peril Safaka. So it's related to the one we saw earlier, but it's a different species. And we went on a night walk, and we saw quite a few chameleons, et cetera. And this is just one of them. It's pretty hard to photograph at night when they're way up in the tree, when you're shining your flashlight on them and so forth. So I didn't get too many good pictures on your night walk, but this one turned out pretty good. And we did see this. This is a mouse lemur. And apparently it's potentially a putative new species that's been recently segregated from some of the other mouse lemurs. And they're in the process of describing it. As we walked around the dry forest here, we saw quite a few reptiles. This is one that I think is called the Warted Chameleon, or maybe Untitled Chameleon. And here's the Warted Chameleon. Now I think it's the same one. It's just on a brown log or on a green log. So they changed their color. And then we saw these, this is called the Pleated Lizard. They were pretty common, hiding underneath the sticks and logs next to the trail. They weren't very big, they were maybe 6 to 8 inches long. And then we saw these big clumps of roots. Now, does anybody know what this is? This is an orchid. Testing time. Nope. These are microcelia, the leafless orchid. And it's very common in this area. They have, when they bloom, tiny little white flowers, and they are just this mass of roots. So when people grow them here, you just basically hang a string up, and then all you have is this massive roots hanging down from it. Also in this park were lots of, what I think were Eulophia or possibly Oceoclades. So that's the leaves that you can see, the green leaves here in the leaf litter. And again, more orchids of Bulbophyllum, one of the few ones that we saw in bloom. So here's the Rachis on the right-hand side with the little purple flowers. And in this park was this wonderful lake. And we went for a boat ride around in the lake. And everywhere where people washed their clothes, there were these poles between them and the lake. And they would wash very carefully inside this pole barrier. And I wondered, why was this? And they said, well, it's because of the crocodiles. And then we saw this enormous crocodile sunning himself on a rock. And I swear that guy must have been 20 feet long. He was huge. So I can certainly imagine why you wouldn't want to wash your clothes too close to the water and become crocodile lunch. Okay, here's one of the birds that we saw on our boat ride, a little kingfisher. This is the Madagascar fish eagle, also one of the rarest fish eagles, and for birdos, this is a lot of people go to see this particular species. And then this wonderful heron that was poking around in the high grass. And now we're that was basically the end of the trip with Stuart, and now we're on the trip with Johan and Claire Hermans. And so on this trip, we started off in the Central Highlands and headed down the middle of the island in the Central Highland area. If you look out there, what do you see? You see a lot of red earth. That used to be a forest. It is now completely deforested, and almost all of that is either mud that they're making bricks out of or desperately trying to get something to grow. But when you fly over the island, that's what you see, just miles and miles and miles of this red. And people say Madagascar is bleeding, and it really is. When it rains, all that soil just washes away. Now, down in the Central Islands, there are a number of national parks, and this one is very close to the city of Antananarivo. It's about a 2-hour drive outside of the city. And it's characterized by these big rocks called inselbergs, which means they're basically rock islands. And they're sticking up out of this wasteland of mud and so forth. But because it's a national park, there's trees here and there are orchids here. So within minutes of walking into this park, we began to see terrestrial orchids. We saw the ones that we saw earlier. Here's that Oberonia distica again on the right, and then the one on the left. I'm not sure what genus that is, but you can see that there's seed pods at the top of the spikes there. This is a Polystachya. We saw quite a few of these, and then this giant Engracum. Again, I don't know which species it is, but there's not too many that are this big. So those leaves were easily 1.5 to 2 feet long. So it's a really big plant. And then here are the little terrestrials, Cyanorcus ridleyi. And these were sort of interspersed along next to the road, growing in the road. They were pretty common. Here we are walking on the top of one of these inselbergs. And where that dry grassy material is, that's Johan Hermans there walking towards it. Apparently in the wet season, there's a lot of orchids growing in amongst the grasses there, but it was the dry season, we didn't really see anything. Here's just a roadside site. Everybody's selling their vegetables, beautifully displayed along the side of the road. And then here's what I meant by, there are rice fields, but most of it is this devastated landscape where there used to be beautiful forests and now there's nothing left. There are a few patches where there's some medicinal plants that they've kept the forest because they're of value to them. And as soon as you walk into one of those forests, you almost instantly see orchids. And this is one of those places where we stopped along the side of the road and went for a short walk in the woods. And we saw these Engracoids just growing along on the rocks. This was an interesting place. Johan had reading glasses, and one of the other women on our trip had her very expensive glasses. And somehow they both lost their glasses within about 20 seconds of getting into the woods there. And most of us spent the rest of the time looking for their glasses, which we never found. And my friend Zita and I, we went off and we got these great pictures of some of the Engracums growing on the rocks. Let's see. We did find a few plants of this. This is another terrestrial called Eulophia. They're pretty small little flowers, but pretty nice to see. And there's several different species of Eulophia in Madagascar. So it's a pretty common terrestrial genus there. After traveling through this wasteland for several hours, we turned off the road, and within a minute or two, we were in this incredible forest. And this is Mufana National Park. And apparently, all of the area around it, with 20 years ago, was forested. It's only been recently deforested. And the only reason this park is even here is that about 20 years ago, some scientists discovered a rare and new species of bamboo lemur. So they created this park to preserve lemur. And thank goodness they did. This was one of the nicest parks that we visited. Right along the side of the road, there was these huge stands of the Cyanorcus liliana. There was probably, I don't know, several hundred plants there just growing alongside the road in full bloom. And they were just absolutely spectacular. And Claudia, I won't tell the story about how you rolled down the hill here. Leave that out. I see her there. She's going to tell that story.
I don't think that was there. I think you're mistaken about your memory.
All right. And then when we went on a trail, we just as we entered the forest, there was this incredible Engracum just hanging right down over our heads as we entered the trail. So in full bloom, I mean, it was really amazing to see that. And here's just stepping back from it a bit so you get the impression of the plant. In the same area, we found Arangus alicei, and then these wonderful aeonias. This is kind of a vining orchid. It turned out to be fairly common. We saw it on several different places on the trip, but it was one of my favorites. It was very, very cute. Also in this forest, we found this Engracum Terraphillum, and this is Arangus citrata, which probably many of you grow. And so I just put a enlarged version at the bottom just so you could see the flowers. So we found that one in bloom. And then here's an Engracoid about to bloom. So beautiful bud on that one. And more bulbophyllums. This one's called Oculotta. This one, Johan Herman thinks it's a new species. So he's in the process of describing it. And we found big trunks full of this bulbophyllum, which is called Leptostachium. And so here's one of the tree trunks just covered with that particular bulbophyllum. And this is a little terrestrial that we found called Goodyeara Zelii. And then on the right is a blow up of the flowers. I mean, the plants kind of, but when you get a close up of the flowers, they're actually quite interesting to take a look at. And here's another species that was very common and pretty boring. They had little tiny flowers, and there's quite a few benthamias, and they all kind of look like green sticks with the tiny green flowers on them. Chirostylus is a genus that we saw in Yunnan of all places, and also in Thailand, but here there are plants represented in Madagascar. So here's a different species of Cyanorcus, Rosalotta. And this one was growing not only terrestrial, but growing in the leaf litter, in the crooks of the trees and so forth. So you can see this one sort of epiphytically growing. And some more Cyanorcus. We saw quite a few different species of Cyanorcus in this particular national park. And I think one of the most spectacular things on this trip was this. This is Gastodia agnicelius. It made headlines all over the world last year as the ugliest orchid in the world. It was in the Smithsonian, it was in National Geographic, it was in the New York Times, and it was discovered on our OCA trip. And this is actually a picture I took, but the picture that Rick Burrian took, Johan used it to describe the species, and that was the picture that went viral. So that was pretty interesting to be there to see this. Here's another Cyanorcus. Again, it's growing in the leaf litter on the surface of the tree, even though it's actually a terrestrial orchid. And then these little Giraffenik Weevils are very characteristic insect that a lot of people go to Madagascar to see because they're so curious. They're only found in one species of tree. And so once you see that tree, if you go look in it, you'll always find one of these weevils. On the right is a leaf-tailed gecko. And as you look at his tail, you can see it looks like a leaf. And so you can understand why they call it a leaf-tailed gecko. And here is another leaf-tailed gecko. Now, aren't they curious creatures? They're very tiny. They're like 3 to 4 inches long and so well camouflaged. Again, the guide knows where they are, I think, because they don't move too far from one tree to another. Here's a few more. This one's called the short-nosed chameleon. It was kind of funny-looking guy with this little proboscis nose. And then here's the bamboo lemur that they formed the park around. This is the gray bamboo lemur. And there's another one there called the brown bamboo lemur as well. And then again, another mongoose, because we were eating our lunch, he showed up and basically was looking for a handout. Now, after visiting that park, we traveled further down the spine of the country, seeing these incredible rock formations, as you can see off in the distance on the right. And this, again, we're in this very arid area. Much of the forest is gone, but there are patches of forest still up along the edges of these mountains. And the reason they're there is partly because of some funeral customs where they bury their dead. They don't actually bury them. They put them in a coffin up in these forests for a year or two, and then they take them out and rebury them or something. But that's why there's still forests here. And it's a good place to go looking for both plants and animals. So we stayed here overnight. And this place we were actually glamping. These are our tents. So this is Claudia, that's our tent, remember? And,
Yes, I do.
And the grounds here were just fantastic. These amazing succulents, fantastic insects. Rick Burrian was running around taking pictures of these giant locusts and some other very bizarre insects. And there was lots of chameleons and so forth in these shrubs around the camp. The next day, we went hiking up the massif, up a trail that's basically at the foot of one of those giant rocks. And we climbed up here to see the plant that's on the right. This is Sobinacophia humbertiana. And Johan was really hoping that we'd see this in bloom because I guess we were there at the right time, but somehow it wasn't the right time that year. And it's really too bad because that's what they look like when they're in bloom. And this particular plant took up the entire surface of the rock. So it would have been about 20 by 20 feet. And to have seen that in bloom would have just been spectacular. In this area also, there's all kinds of these weird spiny plants. So I'm not sure what this one is, but it's a pretty cool looking plant. Here's a view of the mountains at sunset and some of the lizards that we saw. There's a gecko and a plated lizard. And now we're going to one of the most famous national parks in Madagascar called the Salo. And people go here to see the rocks, not so much the plants. It has these incredible rock formations. It's kind of like the equivalent of the Grand Canyon of Madagascar, only instead of seeing a canyon, you're seeing these incredibly colorful rock formations. So we went for a long hike in this park. It was incredibly hot and sunny, so we're putting on our sunscreen before we set off. And we hiked for about 3 hours through the shrubby brushes. And we found some really amazing plants. So here's a Pachypodium. We saw quite a few of these. There's just a couple of pictures of them here. And then in the middle of the park was this oasis where all the tourists were swimming. I don't think I would go swimming in there, but anyway, they were swimming. And just all around this little oasis were these amazing rocks. So you can see why people go to visit it. It's really, very inspiring rocks. This is a big stand of another terrestrial orchid called Eulophia ramosa, and a little periwinkle type plant called Calaranthia roseus that we saw a few plants of growing right out of the rocks, essentially. We saw scorpions and the swift, which is another kind of lizard. Here's a close-up of another chameleon that we saw just making his way slowly through the trees. And when we stopped for lunch, of course, the lemurs showed up. And here there were both ringtail gleamers as well as one of the Safaka species. Okay, after visiting this park, we were there for a couple of days, but those were really just the highlights of it. The hotel we stayed at in that park was spectacular, highly recommended. We traveled south to this other national park called Zombitsi National Park, which is as far south as we went on this trip, essentially. It's just a bit of dry forest that's protected. And as soon as you get out of the car, we saw this kua, which is a big, I think he's flightless, or if he does fly, he doesn't fly very far. Big bird, about maybe a foot long or so, big bird. And this forest, we had a few lemurs. So this is one that's endemic just to this little forest called the Zumbitsi sportive lemur. And then we saw lots of orchids in this. And unfortunately, we just timed it wrong. So this is Orangus spiculata. We saw dozens of plants of this, all about to flower 2 days after we left, I'm sure. But it would have been amazing to see them. And we found lots of different Engracoids in this forest, none of which were in bloom. Also, we saw some of these incredible Baobab trees just towering up above the shrubs. They were really impressive. And on our way back, we passed this area where they're mining for sapphires. So this is how they do it. They dig around in the mud, and there was pockets of holes and stuff for miles along the side of the road. Then they wash whatever it is off in the river, and they catch all kinds of diseases and so forth. And that's where your sapphires come from. A lot of them is this kind of mining. And when you went through this town, it was really depressing. I mean, it was just a miserable life to spend your whole life digging in a hole to find a sapphire. But I guess if you find one, you're a rich man. This is a famous rock formation called the Window of the Salo that we stopped to get a picture of in the evening on our way back to the hotel, and just some of the plants that were around in the ground there. So Euphorbia, kalanchoas are pretty common in Madagascar, lots of different species. And as we were making our way back up towards Antananarivo, we stopped at these boiler things and learned what they were doing. So they grow vast fields of geraniums, and they basically distill it and make this geranium oil as an essential oil. And so this girl was selling geranium oil by the side of the road. So we stopped and bought a little bottle of geranium oil. In Antananarivo, if you have the chance, there's this really cool sculpture garden where the artist there makes these baobab trees out of car wrecks. So he has all these, and oil drums as well. So all these bits of pieces of metal, and he's made these amazing sculptures of birds and trees and so forth in this sculpture garden. And if you were so inclined, you could actually buy one of these to take home, although it'd be a little hard to get in your suitcase. Now, let's go visit the Eastern Rainforest. This is, at one time, it was probably one of the most biodiverse places in the world. There's just little patches of it left, but still what's left is pretty spectacular. On our way there, we stopped at a little sort of a zoo called the Peril Nature Farm. And they have this enclosed, basically wood, where he's got all these chameleons basically running around free, and you can get up really close to them and get really good pictures. And there was actually about a dozen different species in this little enclosure. So we got some great shots. Here's this great frog. This is called a tomato frog. I wonder why. It looks like a big tomato. Here's one of those leaf geckos. Look at his feet. Those really amazing. And then some crazy frogs. Now, one of the places that we stayed was this Eulophia Lodge, which is adjacent to what's called the Ioroka Reserve. And this lodge is there because of Eulophia, which there's just a few places left in Madagascar where this particular plant grows, and one of them is very close to the lodge. So we stayed there. Johan and Claire were very keen to get a picture of the Eulophia in bloom. So we set off on an expedition the next day to actually see if we could find it. On the way, we spotted some really cool bulbophyllums. There's some more. This one's called Platypodium. And the one on the right is called Turritibulbum. And then here's the Eulophia. It grows at the very top of the pandanus tree. So I don't know if you can see it, but on the left-hand side, there's a tall tree that sort of looks like long, grassy, like leaves. And in the very top of that, in the inset, is the Eulophia that's growing there. And you can see the flower. Let's see if I can show it here. That's the flower right there. It's not in bloom, it's in bud. And it probably was going to open about 2 weeks after we were there. So disappointed, we headed back. We then visited this park, which many people that go to Madagascar go to this park. It's famous for the Indiri, which is a type of lemur that has this very haunting call. And this is really about the only place they're still in the wild. As you enter the park, again, the guide takes you to show you the chameleon, who's always in the same tree. But it's still amazing because I couldn't even tell he was there until he pointed me, because he just faded so well into the tree that it was almost impossible to make him out. Another microcelia, very unusual one with bright orange flowers called Kilpine. And then we began to find some great Engracoids in bloom. So here's Dumelia stenophylla. You probably saw, I don't know, 20 or so different plants of this in bloom in the forest. Lots of bulbophyllum. So this is one called Orifolium. And then on the right is another one called Henricii. Bulbophyllum francoisii was probably the most common bulbophyllum that we saw in this forest. We saw dozens and dozens of plants of it, and they were all in bloom. So it was really a treat to see them, as well as this Analella. I might even pronounce it. It's one of these Malagasy words with too many syllables. But anyway, we saw lots of plants of that in bloom as well. And interestingly, the francoisii and this other bulbophyllum were almost always growing in the same tree, just a few feet from one another. Here's another Engracum. We found a big patch of these growing on the forest floor. This is one called Implicatum. And Horrendous Lacontia. Many of us grow this or have this in their collections. And here's where it comes from. Also, Aranthes schlechteri. And very characteristic long nectar hanging down from the back of the flower. Another Engracum called Concho Blossom. This one grew way up high in the trees, so you had to capture this one with your zoom lens. And that's probably why it's a little bit out of focus. And then this one called Horrendous Lacontia. And we just saw one plant of this, but it was really pretty spectacular plant. Again, another bulbophyllum called Planatum and Engracum Terraphillum. We saw this earlier in the Mufana forest as well, but here it is in this rainforest. And then at night we went around, and these amazing comet moths that must have been 8 inches long were hanging in a tree right outside our restaurant where we went for dinner. And there was probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 of these just hanging there in the tree. Just spectacular moths. Okay, here's the Diademid Safaka that's found in this woods. And this guy was actually pretty tame. I guess one of the guards had basically trained him to come and eat the leaves out of his hand. So he actually came right down to us, and we were able to get some great photos. And then here's some of the other, I think that's a Safaka. And then in this area, there's this tourist place called Lemur Island, where you float around on these little canoes, and there's different islands, and on the different islands are different lemurs. And what I liked about this place is if you look at the lemur on the top right, doesn't he look like the one in the movie Madagascar? He's a crazy guy. So that's actually a female black lemur, but pretty amazing little place. But as soon as you stopped your boat, they jumped on your head. So we had lemurs all over us. We had ringtail gleamers, we had bamboo lemurs, we had all kinds of lemurs walking around on their heads and their shoulders and everything. And everybody got a big kick out of that. All right, last part of the trip, we went to the Pengalis. That is an inland sea sort of. It's a canal that was built by the French for shipping because this side of the island has very rough waters. And so they built this narrow channel that goes almost the length of the island where they could then bring supplies and so forth down this canal instead of out in the open water. That canal is still there. I don't think it's used for shipping anymore, but it's used for tourists and fishing. And there's lots of fishing here. This is a fish trap that you can see here on the right. At the end of the trip, there's a beautiful resort. And in the back part of the resort, there's a big vanilla plantation. So here's the vanilla growing. And if you look on the top right, you can see vanilla beans right there. They're not ripe yet, but Madagascar is one of the is probably the leading supplier of vanilla in the world.
Is it
Even though-
endemic?
Well, yeah, but this vanilla comes from Mexico. Yeah, but there are vanillas that are endemic there. Okay, just some of the things we saw in and around the resort area. We saw Arangus citrata just growing on one of the trees in the resort. There were quite a few Arangus Engracum sesquipedales. That's shown here on the top over here. This Oniella was growing on the tree right outside one of the guest cabins, so we got a great view of that. And this other plant was growing, I think, next to the restaurant that we went to that evening. So it's probably not naturally there, but it's from that area and obviously thrives with no attention. In the evening, you can go by boat to another island and see this absolutely bizarre lemur called the Ai. It has this very bizarre finger, which is used to dig out the meat of the coconut. And it's just the ugliest little thing, but we got great pictures of it. And the Malagasy people used to think this was an evil lemur, and they went to great extents to kill it and wipe it out. So there are very few of these left. And this little island where they are is one of the few reserves where they're protected. There he is, a pretty ugly little guy. All right, so as we were walking around the forest here, we saw hundreds of this Cymbidiella flabulata, which is about 3.5 to 4 feet tall spike, and then at the top of it are, a dozen or so of these very colorful flowers. And I was in the same area with Stuart's trip 2 years prior. We walked right by all of this. We never even saw them. I'm sure they were there. We just, didn't know where to look. So one of the good reasons to go with orchid experts is they know where to look. And then this Engracum elephanticum was all over the base of these trees that were growing in this area. And interestingly, all of the trees that were growing in that area were non-native. They were Australian plants that had been brought in because they grow quickly. They weren't eucalyptus, but they were another brushy short plant. And this Engracum had just adapted to that new host and was very abundant. So, even if the normal tree is gone, apparently some orchids can be quite handy and grow in a different tree. We saw, again, more Cyanorcus. This is a new species again, Fastidiosa. And at the very end of this long walk that we went on, there's another nutrient poor area. And here we found huge stands of Nepenthes madagascarensis, as well as another putative species of Nepenthes, and I've forgotten what the name of it is now. but it had slightly different pictures. And they both grow together in this big swampy area, just a few miles from the actual resort that we were staying at. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it and aren't too depressed by all the things that have happened to Madagascar. There's still some great things to see there, but it definitely is a paradise in peril. So thank you.